the forest of sighs on the outskirts of a small town in the lakes region of Chile. There was a forest known as the Forest of Sighs. It was said that anyone who entered the forest after dark would never be seen again. A young adventurer named Diego decided to defy the legend and entered the forest one night. Armed only with a flashlight, Diego walked through the trees, listening to the wind rustle through the leaves. As he moved forward, he began to hear soft, melancholy whispers that seemed to come from all directions. They were voices that spoke in such a low tone that I could barely understand what they were saying. Diego followed the voices until he reached a clearing where there was an old oak tree. As they approached the tree, the whispers became louder and clearer. They were pleading voices asking for help and deliverance. Suddenly, Diego felt a cold hand touch his shoulder. He turned to come face to face with an ethereal figure. She was a woman of supernatural beauty, with sad eyes and an expression of despair. The woman explained to Diego that she and many other souls were trapped in the forest, condemned to wander forever. He asked Diego to help them find peace and liberation. Diego, moved by the sadness in the woman's eyes, promised to do everything possible to help them. He spent days and nights searching for a way to free the trapped souls. Finally, after much effort and sacrifice, Diego managed to free the souls from the forest. The Forest of Sighs became silent and Diego was able to return to his town as a hero. But every night, when the wind blows strong, the villagers can hear a soft sigh coming from the forest. It is a reminder of Diego's brave act and of the souls that once roamed the forest. The Echo of Fear. It was a dark and stormy night in the small town of San Rosendo. The rain fell heavily and thunder rumbled in the sky, illuminating the deserted streets. In the middle of the storm, a lone figure walked down the main street. It was young Pedro, returning home after his shift at the factory. Pedro lived in an old house on the outskirts of town, next to the forest. The house had been in her family for generations and was full of memories and antiques, but it was also full of secrets. That night, when Pedro got home, he noticed something strange. The front door was ajar, and the light in the hall flickered. With his heart pounding, he entered the house and called his grandmother, but there was no answer. He decided to look for her in his room, but when he went upstairs he heard a strange sound coming from the attic. It was a sound I had never heard before, a distant echo that seemed like a mix of laughter and crying. Afraid but determined to find out what was happening, Pedro went up to the attic. What he found there took his breath away. In the middle of the attic, surrounded by a circle of candles, was her grandmother. But she wasn't the sweet old lady he knew. His eyes shone with an unearthly light and his voice resonated with a deep and terrifying echo. "Pedro," he said with a chilling smile, "you have finally arrived." At that moment, Pedro realized the terrible truth. Her grandmother had been practicing black magic and had summoned an evil spirit that now possessed her. With all his might, Pedro fought the spirit using everything he knew about the protection rituals his grandmother had taught him as a child. After a long and exhausting battle, he finally managed to free his grandmother from the evil spirit. Exhausted but relieved, Pedro hugged his grandmother, promising to never leave her alone again. But as they walked away from the attic, they couldn't help but look back. The echo of fear still echoed in the empty attic. The cursed mirror. Once upon a time there was a man named Carlos who lived in an old mansion in the heart of Santiago. One day, while exploring the attic, he found an old mirror covered in dust. Intrigued, Carlos cleaned the mirror and hung it in his room. But from that day, strange things began to happen. At night, Carlos could hear whispers coming from the mirror. At first, he thought it was his imagination, but the whispers became louder and clearer each night. One night, Carlos woke up to find his reflection in the mirror staring back at him. But there was something strange about his reflection. His eyes were black as night and his smile was evil. Terrified, Carlos tried to get rid of the mirror, but no matter what he did, the mirror always reappeared in his room. Carlos lived in constant fear of his own reflection. Every night, the whispers grew louder and her reflection became more frightening. Finally, one night, Carlos couldn't take it anymore. He grabbed a hammer and hit the mirror with all his strength. But instead of breaking, the mirror absorbed the blow and then returned it with tremendous force, launching Carlos across the room. When Carlos woke up, he was alone in his room. The mirror had disappeared. But every time he looked at himself on any reflective surface, he could see the black eyes and evil smile of his reflection staring back at him. Since then, Carlos lives in constant fear of his own reflection, a constant reminder of the cursed mirror he found in the attic. The Mansion of Whispers. In a small town in the south of Chile, there lived a boy named Manuel with his mother, Isadora. They lived in an old mansion that had belonged to Manuel's family for generations. The mansion, although beautiful, had an eerie atmosphere and was full of secrets. One day, a stranger came to town. He was a tall, thin man, with dark eyes and a mysterious smile. He introduced himself as an old friend of Manuel's father, who had disappeared many years ago. The stranger stayed in the mansion with Manuel and Isadora, but since his arrival, strange things began to happen. Manuel began to have nightmares and hear whispers at night. One night, Manuel woke up to find his lightning black horse restless and scared. He followed the horse into the woods behind the mansion, where he found the stranger performing a dark ritual. The stranger summoned a demon that emerged from the shadows. The demon had glowing red eyes and a chilling laugh. He demanded a sacrifice and the stranger pointed to Manuel. Just when the demon was about to take Manuel, Manuel's father appeared. He had been living secretly in the forest, protecting his family from the stranger. Manuel's father fought the demon while Isadora carried Manuel to safety. But the demon was too strong. At that moment a priest from the town appeared. With his faith and courage, the priest managed to exorcise the demon and free Manuel's father. The stranger was expelled from the town and peace returned to the mansion. But every time Manuel looks into the forest, he can't help but remember the terrible night they faced the demon. The porcelain doll. There was an antique store that was famous for its collection of porcelain dolls. Among all the dolls there was one that always attracted attention, a porcelain doll with a red dress and bright blue eyes. One day, a girl named Valeria walked into the store and fell in love with the doll. She convinced her mother to buy it for her and brought her home full of joy. But from the day the doll arrived at her house, strange things began to happen. Valeria began to have nightmares and hear soft laughter in the middle of the night. The doll seemed to move on its own, appearing in places where Valeria hadn't left it. One night, Valeria woke up to find the doll sitting at the foot of her bed, looking at her with its bright blue eyes. Valeria screamed and ran to look for her parents. When they returned, the doll was no longer at the foot of the bed. She was sitting on her shelf as if nothing had happened. Valeria insisted that the doll was possessed and her parents decided to return it to the antique store, but when they arrived they found the store empty and abandoned. Since then Valeria never had a porcelain doll again. But every time she sees one, she can't help but remember the doll's bright blue eyes and the soft laughter she heard in the middle of the night. The lament of the mountain in the high mountains of the Andes, in Chile. It was said that there was an ancient spirit that lived in the snowy peaks. The locals called it the mountain's lament. One day, a young mountaineer named Rodrigo decided to climb the highest mountain, despite the warnings of the town's residents. He wanted to demonstrate his daring and challenge the legend. Rodrigo began his ascent at dawn. As I climbed, the wind grew colder and the air thinner. But Rodrigo was strong and determined to reach the summit. When he finally reached the summit, he was met with a stunning view, but he also heard something that made his blood run cold, a soft, sad wail that seemed to come from the mountain itself. Rodrigo looked around and saw an ethereal figure emerging from the snow. She was a woman of supernatural beauty, with tears frozen on her cheeks. She was the spirit of the mountain. The woman explained to Rodrigo that she had died and was trapped in the mountain, condemned to wander forever in the snowy peaks. He asked Rodrigo to help him find peace and be able to ascend. Rodrigo, moved by her story, promised to do everything he could to help her. He spent days and nights searching for a way to free the spirit of the woman on the mountain. Finally, after much effort and sacrifice, Rodrigo managed to free the spirit of the mountain. She was able to free herself from the curse and was able to ascend. The wailing ceased and the spirit disappeared in a flurry of snow. Rodrigo returned to town. But every time he looked up at the mountains, he could hear the echo of the mountain's lament, a constant reminder of the spirit that once dwelt there. The shadow in the window. In a small town in the north of Chile there lived a woman named Rosa. Rosa was known in the town for her kindness and beauty, but also for the sadness that always seemed to accompany her. Rosa lived in an old house at the end of the main street. The house, although beautiful, was always in shadow, no matter how much the sun was shining. But the most disturbing thing about the house was the second-floor window. Every night, when the sun set and the moon rose in the sky, a shadow appeared in the window. It was the silhouette of a man, tall and thin, who seemed to be looking down the street. The townspeople were terrified by the shadow. No one dared approach the house after dark, and many claimed to have seen the shadow moving and even pointing at them. Rosa, however, seemed not to notice the shadow. Every night, after everyone had gone to sleep, she would go up to the second floor and spend hours looking out the window. No one knew what he was doing there or why he didn't seem afraid of the shadow. One night, a brave young man decided to find out what was happening. He approached the house and looked up at the second-story window. What he saw took his breath away. Rosa was standing by the window, but she was not alone. Beside him was the shadow, which no longer seemed so threatening. On the contrary, he seemed to be comforting Rosa, who was crying uncontrollably. The young man ran to get help, but when he returned to the other villagers, the window was empty. Rosa and the shadow had disappeared. From that night on, no one saw Rosa or the shadow again. The house, at the end of the main street, remains empty and in shadow, a constant reminder of the mystery that was never solved. The Whisper of the Wind. In a small coastal town in Chile there was an ancient legend about an abandoned lighthouse. It was said that on full moon nights you could hear a rustle in the wind coming from the lighthouse. A young man named Mateo, curious and brave, decided to investigate. One full moon night he gathered his courage and headed to the lighthouse. As he got closer, the wind began to blow stronger and the whispers became clearer. They were voices that spoke in an ancient and unknown language, but Mateo could feel the desperation and fear in them. Upon reaching the lighthouse, Mateo climbed the stairs to the top. There he found an old oil lamp that was still burning, even though the lighthouse had been abandoned for years. Mateo looked through the lighthouse window and saw something that made his blood run cold. In the middle of the ocean, a huge dark figure emerged from the waters. It was a creature like none he had ever seen before, with glowing eyes and tentacles that stretched toward the sky. The voices in the wind became louder and more desperate. Mateo then understood that the voices were the souls of the sailors lost at sea, trapped by the creature. With a scream of terror, Mateo ran from the lighthouse and returned to the city. But the voices on the wind followed him, whispering in his ear every night of the full moon. Since then, no one dares to approach the lighthouse at night. And on full moon nights, if you listen closely, you can hear the whisper of the wind carrying with it the voices of lost sailors. The Clock of Death. In a port city in Chile there was an old watchmaker named Ernesto. Ernesto was famous for his ability to repair any clock, but there was one clock he always refused to touch, an old cuckoo clock that had belonged to his great-grandfather. The watch was said to be cursed. According to legend, the clock had the power to predict death. Every time someone was about to die, the cuckoo would come out and sing at midnight. One day, a young man named Pablo entered Ernesto's store with the old cuckoo clock. He had found the clock in his grandmother's attic and wanted Ernesto to repair it. Despite his fears, Ernesto agreed to repair the clock, but that night, when the clock struck midnight, the cuckoo came out and sang. Ernesto felt a chill run down his spine. He knew what the cuckoo song meant. He ran to Pablo's house, only to find the young man dead. From that day on, Ernesto never touched the cuckoo clock again, but every time he hears a cuckoo singing, he can't help but remember the terrible night when the clock predicted Pablo's death. The Lake of Lost Souls. In the heart of Patagonia is a lake known as the Lake of Lost Souls. It is said that those who dare to swim in its cold, dark waters are never seen again. One day, a young daredevil named Javier decided to challenge the legend. Despite the warnings of the town elders, Javier entered the waters of the lake. As he swam, he began to feel a cold current dragging him toward the bottom of the lake. He fought against the current, but it was too strong. Just when he thought he was going to drown, he saw a bright light in the darkness. He followed the light and emerged in an underwater cave. In the cave, Javier found the lost souls. They were spirits trapped in the lake, condemned to wander forever in its depths. The souls explained to Javier that they were trapped by an ancient curse and asked him to help them find peace. Javier promised to do everything possible to free them. He spent days and nights looking for a way to break the curse, and after much effort he found it. Finally Javier managed to free the souls from the lake. Now the Lake of Lost Souls was silent and Javier was able to return to his town, tired, but with the joy of having helped those trapped souls. But every time he looks toward the lake, Javier can hear the echo of the voices of lost souls, a constant reminder of what happens to people who defy the legend. The Ghost of the Theater in the heart of Valparaiso is an old theater that has been the scene of countless plays over the years. But there is a story that all actors and actresses know, that of the ghost of the theater. It is said that many years ago a famous actor named Ricardo died tragically during a performance. Since then, his spirit has remained in the theater, appearing in rehearsals and on opening nights. One day, a young actress named Isabella came to the theater. Despite warnings about the ghost, Isabella decided to stay after rehearsal to practice. While she was on stage, the lights began to flicker and an ethereal figure appeared before her. It was Ricardo, the ghost of the theater. Ricardo explained to Isabella that he was stuck in theater because of his love of acting. He asked Isabella to help him find peace and liberation. Isabella, moved by his story, promised to do everything she could to help him. He spent days and nights searching for a way to free Ricardo's spirit. Finally, after much effort and sacrifice, Isabel managed to free Ricardo. The ghost of the theater disappeared and the theater returned to normal. But every time Isabella goes on stage she can feel Ricardo's presence, supporting her from beyond. It is a constant reminder of Ricardo's love of theater and the brave act Isabella performed.